Hello and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we're your hosts for the Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we seek to tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
One tough question that must be answered in the energy transition is, what are the real costs of going green and who is going to pay the bill? In today's episode, we're delighted to have Brad Handler on the show to dive into the topic of private financing. Brad is the program manager for the Sustainable Finance Lab at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines and previously worked on Wall Street for 20 years covering the oil sector.
Here's our conversation with Brad Handler. Brad Handler is the program manager for the Sustainable Finance Lab at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines, which aims to inform and shape public policy on natural resources, energy, and the environment. He researches how to spur more private institutional investment into lowering carbon emissions with an emphasis on fossil fuel assets, carbon removal, and carbon offset markets. Brad is a former Wall Street equity research analyst with 20 years of experience covering the oil sector at firms including Credit Suisse and Jefferies, and has presented at various industry conferences and company seminars. Brad holds a bachelor's in economics from Johns Hopkins University and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Thank you, Brad, for joining us on Energy Transition Talk.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
And today we're talking about the cost of going green, which is a hot topic for many people who care about the environment and the economy. So maybe could we start with fossil fuel subsidies, and which are a huge part of this equation. So maybe could you walk us through what fossil fuel subsidies are and how they work?
Sure. It's probably a more complicated question than you even realize in some ways, because there are various forms of it. There are direct subsidies, as we might think of them today, when consumers, people in various countries across the world they pay less than the cost of delivering oil or that whatever that fuel is, or electricity, because it is part of what a government is doing to make their lives a little bit easier, right? Part of an objective in fostering electrification in a country or enabling transportation ease in a country sometimes, maybe often, involves some form of subsidy. So there are direct subsidies, which of course are very popular, and so they're very difficult to unwind, right? You're going to tell someone that they have to pay a lot more to fill up their tank of gas, or pay a lot more for heating their home or something. So those are very difficult to unwind. Some of what you see written, and some it's very good product too, refers to, I guess you'd almost call them indirect subsidies, because a lot of the conversation we have is to talk about putting a price tag on something, global warming or carbon emissions, where that has not historically been the case at all. And so the externality, as it is referred to, in terms of there's an impact of burning a gallon of gasoline, which has historically not been captured, is still not demanded to be captured in many, many, many legislatures. And so layering in some additional cost of carbon and what that should be is another form of subsidy worth thinking about, but it makes the numbers very large, but that's just a step beyond. And so it's careful when people think about subsidies of industries to recognize that there are some differences, because we are starting to overlay the externality. And then there's still another form of subsidy, and again, I'll try to tighten it up, but there's still another form of subsidy, which is sort of some of the basic investment credits to try to get more oil and gas out of the ground, which are consistent with the kinds of investment credits that we give to all sorts of other industries as well. And so those are often pointed to as, we have to stop that. Well, they are brought forward in this country and others as just part of a suite of investment credits that we provide to industries of all different sorts. And so, yes, it would have to be a conscious effort to say, nope, we're not going to do that for this industry anymore.
And speaking of large numbers, Brad, fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record of $7 trillion last year. So why do governments around the world continue to spend so much money on supporting fossil fuels, despite them being harmful to climate and to human health?
Well, Pauline, I appreciate you bringing in, a real number, and I believe you're referring to an IMF study, which was written over the summer. That's a great example of saying it's 7 trillion, but I think it's 2/3 of that. I could be a little bit off on the proportions, but I think something like 2/3 of that are putting in a cost of carbon. So actually putting a specific value on an externality. So someone else, I only say that, not to say that 3 trillion is not a pretty big number too, but I only point that out because at least some of the response has to be, well, that's layering in almost a degree of responsibility that a number of countries, most countries in the world aren't really doing. But as for the direct subsidy portion, it kind of gets at those other points that I was trying to make, that these are, for good or for ill, they have been part of a policy which have enabled citizens of the world to gain access to energy more cheaply, to enable economic development, to enable perception of give them more economic opportunities, to allow them to heat their homes. And they become, of course, very politically popular, right? Making it cheaper to heat your home is a very politically popular thing to do. So unwinding that, even if it's terribly important from a global warming perspective, is really, really difficult to do.
Yeah, and we put a lot of money into fossil fuels. So if we are going to decarbonize, that will surely need a lot of investment as well. So my next question is, how much will it cost to decarbonize our economies and switch from fossil fuels to renewables? It's not going to be easy, but can you give us a sense of how much investment might be needed globally, and what are the main sectors or areas that would need this investment?
Yeah. Fortunately, I get to once again piggyback on a lot of what really smart people around the world do in terms of the work that they do. And there have been a lot of studies from the International Energy Agency and others trying to address that question. And however you cut it, and I'll offer a little bit of context around one, but it is absolutely measured in the trillions of dollars per year. And so there is no denying that this is a massive, massive, incredibly challenging effort. There's a study that McKinsey did, I guess it's probably a couple of years ago now, maybe it's not quite that old, that I really liked, because essentially what it did was it said, okay, the global total in their view was something like $9 trillion per year if you were going to decarbonize by 2050. And it broke it down into various industries. And so I had to jot down the numbers to remind myself, but from their study, mobility, sort of changing cars and such, was about 40% of the total. Power was about 20%. Changing buildings for a great deal more energy efficiency was about 20% of the total. Agriculture about 10%, and then everything else was the rest, another 10. But what it did that I liked, and not to say that others don't, I just happened to notice that it did, was it said, of the 9.2 trillion a year that's required, the world is already spending let me get the number right, 5.7 of that. So there's $3.5 trillion that per year of spend that would be incremental. And so you'd be redirecting a lot of the spend, a lot of that already goes towards transportation or building buildings or generating electric power. You'd be redirecting those funds within those industries and then spending another $3.5 trillion a year to get where you need to go.
And I think that we're going to be thinking about this money aspect. We're talking about trillions here. And we know there is a huge gap between developed and developing countries when it comes to investing in renewable energies. According to a UN report, developing countries need about 1.7 trillion per year to meet their climate goals by 2030, but they only received about 554 billion in 2022. So there is this very big gap. So the question is, why is this gap so large, and what are the barriers or challenges that are preventing more investment from flowing to developing countries? And understanding kind of these categories that you were delving on a bit ago.
Sure. Great topic to kind of spend some time with. So I guess another way you might have framed the question is that the spending growth that we have seen towards net zero has been dominated by developed economies, right? So if we spent something over, it was $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion or something all in 2022 in clean energy and other associated clean energy transition activities, 90% of that happened in the developed world. The reason that happens, or the way that that happens, is because we have in developed economies, there are a number of things which foster comfort in investing, right? It can be as basic as comfort with rule of law and execution of contracts, deep capital markets where money can flow in lots of different ways relatively easily, right? We have developed stock markets and bond markets. There is also as basic a sense of I can invest in US dollars and I'll get paid in US dollars, which takes the element of uncertainty around is there going to be currency fluctuation away from the conversation. And then there are lots of facilitating, whether it's brokers or it's information providers or it's other elements that help in the process, as well as insurance provision and other things which just foster a degree of risk amelioration, which allow for the investment. As you start to look at the lesser developed economies and developing economies, you have to take a lot of those away. And so you introduce elements of risk which are very difficult to calibrate, very difficult to price in other words. And all of a sudden, investors who had ways of investing in energy transition in a developed economy has to struggle to say, well, how are those risks going to be addressed? And how much more return do I need to get in exchange for assuming greater risk? Because that's really what any investing in whatever sort of part of the capital stack you're dealing with is addressing, right? It's if you're, I'm sorry, I'm not being very clear here. If you're putting debt to work, then yes, you get paid first, and so you need less return than in equity, but you still need some return, and you have a set of options. All of this is basically voluntary. So an institution can invest in the developed world and get a certain return, or it can choose to assume more risks in a lesser developed country, and it wants, or it feels that it needs, in order to fulfill its fiduciary responsibilities to the people that gave them the money, it needs to get more return to compensate for that risk. And so hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of the challenges that really loom. Now, we can start to talk a little bit more about how does one address those challenges, but that's really and I guess we should, but that's really the question that gets framed is, wow, okay, so I can invest in building solar in the United States, and I have a pretty good understanding about how I'm going to get paid, or building solar in a continent that I'm not comfortable investing in, that I know relatively little about, that I'm uncertain about the durability of the government or the state of the contracts or whether things are going to get ripped up, right? You're just introducing a lot that you're asking an investor. If you're going to really spend $1.7 trillion a year, you're asking investors to assume a lot of risk, and you need to help them understand how much it really is and how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like this risk reward analysis, getting investor appetite into developing countries is a big problem here. So what are your thoughts on how we can close this gap and redirect or mobilize this money for the energy transition, especially for developing countries that need it most? Is there a role that institutions like the World Bank can play, maybe in reducing the risks or increasing those returns?
Yes. So I think a lot of the presumption and the basic, which makes a lot of sense, is that public institutions can help bridge and help address some of those risks that I just described. So institutions like the World Bank or other multilateral development institutions and other locals are given money with the express purpose of helping to foster development. And it is generally understood that they don't have enough money themselves to do all of that. They don't have 1.7 trillion at their disposal, but they need to use that money to help catalyze private investment. They can do that in various ways, and there have been various models tried and successfully over time. So the World Bank and others tend to direct lend. So they lend specific chunks of money. By doing so, in principle, if they were to assume certain risks that might cover more than just their own portion of a project, then you might address the risks for private investors to come in. So one natural example is first losses. So a multilateral development bank might come in and say, okay, we're gonna lend, it'll be 10% of the total funds required, but our 10% we will assume responsibility for the first set of losses that come in if a project overruns, for example. Right? So we'll cover that. We won't get, in other words, we won't demand to be repaid under a certain set of circumstances. And so the private capital that comes with us won't have to bear the burden of construction risk in that example. Right? So that's just sort of an easy way to frame it. Government money that acknowledges that its role is to help catalyze private can help be part of the answer for that. Now, that being said, it's not the only answer. Philanthropic entities can play a similar role where they are essentially saying, we'll give our money, or we might invest it with relatively few strings attached or something, but we'll give our money to help address specific issues. What's another example? There are philanthropic efforts which go towards assuming currency risk. Now, these have been fairly small scale so far, but that money can be put to a fund which will lend essentially to do low cost or lower cost currency hedging. That allows for an investor who's putting in US dollars and they're putting it into a country in Africa, and the revenue streams once the project gets going is in that local currency. There is a hedge that can be put in place to protect against too much devaluation risk, which essentially can be based on philanthropic funds. So there's an allowance that those monies might be lost if there is a large devaluation in the currency. But that allows someone else putting money to work to say, oh, good, great. I won't have to bear as much risk as it relates to if the currency goes down. And so I guess I'll try to tie it together, but the logic is that if you can string enough support addressing enough specific risks, and there's ongoing thought work around how do you address certain other risks, and again, what kind of rates of return are going to be required to get private investors involved. But if you can bring a set of tools to the private investor community and say, look, these primary concerns are being taken care of, that leaves you with a reasonable risk reward profile. You should consider putting money to work into developing clean energy around the world.
How does the World Bank absorb that risk?
Well, I guess you'd say that, and this really speaks to the ongoing internal work that the World Bank is doing right now to address its own mandate and to see about how we can grow and how we can become that much more effective. But historically, they were very protective of that. In other words, so they did a whole lot of due diligence themselves on projects, and tended to do direct lending for not 10% of the project need, but 100% of the debt that a project would need. And they would manage their portfolio to try to lose as little money as possible, which is to say they acted kind of like any other bank would act, but with a mandate to work in parts of the world where other banks might not be willing to work. But the problem with that model is they only have so much money. They're not catalyzing private investment in the same way. And so the question has been put to them, how do you not only focus on the environment versus just development, but actually focus on the energy transition that's required, but also how do you raise the catalytic nature of what you do? Bear down harder on those. And so there are entities within the World Bank that do this, but they have been much smaller. There's an entity that provides guarantees, and so they don't put up the capital at all. And that actually is probably the most effective example of leveraging that the World Bank has, but it has been small. And the question is, how can they put the resources to bear to get more money in those directions and therefore do more catalytic work?
And speaking of maybe risks and returns, can we talk about the role of the oil industry in the energy transition? And thinking more broadly, the oil industry being one of the most powerful and profitable sectors in the world, it having a lot of capital and potential to be used for supporting clean energy supplies. However, many oil companies are still making huge profits from selling fossil fuels despite growing cost competitiveness of renewables. We can think of an example, ExxonMobil, the largest oil producer in the US. They had a record net profit of 56 billion in 2022. And maybe this has to do with the high oil prices and gas prices. So maybe what are the factors behind these trends and why oil companies are still so profitable?
Well, I guess that the last little tag on to your question is the easiest. And so I can start there and I can work my way backwards. So oil companies are very profitable because oil is in demand, right? The world demands as much, if not more oil than it has ever demanded. We're right around the 100 million barrel a day mark. You can say, gosh, shouldn't we know better? Shouldn't we make more progress? Shouldn't we move more quickly away from burning fossil fuels? And the answer to that is the planet suggests yes, but oil is really it's an incredibly efficient mode of energy, and the world has spent a lot of time getting very entrenched in terms of leveraging its energy density very well. And it's going to take a long time and a lot of money to kind of move away from that as hard as we try. So I think, 80% of what is consumed energy wise today is still fossil. And yes, the trend that will push lower, but the process is relatively slow. And in the meantime, there is scarcity of oil. There is high demand for oil. So there is a strong price for oil. There are obviously geopolitical concerns which play into that over a short run and long run. But that's sort of a shortish answer of why they still make a lot of money. Now, oil companies are staring at these scenarios for the future and they are choosing, you can see that they are choosing different ways of approaching how they address that. And there has been, and it's still the case, a relatively stark difference between how many of the European majors approached this question versus the US majors. And you mentioned Exxon, but Chevron you can put in sort of a similar bucket. I think the fact that there is this divide has a lot to do with investor base and climate awareness and pressures in various ways that's exercised in Europe. But what you saw were BP and Shell and Total a couple of years ago and then some start to move more aggressively away from trying to think of themselves as oil and gas companies and more towards being energy companies, and more explicit effort on being sort of providing energy as a service. And what that energy source was, you might eventually become kind of, agnostic to. And they put a lot more money into investing in renewables, and they put more effort into hydrogen and some others which could provide other forms of energy down the road. And again, mixing and matching to some degree. They have come under pressure from investors who at the end of the day are still concerned that will require so much investment on the part of these European companies that the return profile for the next decade or so will be compromised. And if you're an investor, you're constantly weighing kind of the needs of the planet versus the needs of your portfolio. And we can get to that a little bit later, but that has really pushed the oil companies who now have some new leadership, at least with Shell and now BP on an interim basis, but that has pushed them to reconfigure some of the emphasis, right? To rebalance a little more in favor, certainly at least of natural gas, and balance that process a bit. Meanwhile, in the US, the focus has been more squarely on becoming low cost, low carbon, at least thinking about scope one, in other words, the emissions involved with producing oil and gas, and then trying to address decarbonization for the world more on a carbon capture and storage basis, right? They too are pursuing hydrogen. There are initiatives in sort of newer energies, but they are somewhat subrogated to the core business of producing oil, almost being a last man standing, right? If in the IEA net zero scenario, oil demand is half by 2050 of what it is today, that's still 50 million barrels a day. And so the Exxon Mobils of the world are saying, we are going to gain access to low cost, prolific, lower carbon basins. Could be the Permian in the United States. It's in ExxonMobil's case, they're building position in Guyana, which is a tremendous field. They're doing a lot with natural gas. And so they're concentrating where they work with an eye in part on their environmental footprint. But mostly, again, sort of, we are going to be one of those last, quote, man standing. Now, part of your question also addressed the sort of the question of what could their role be in energy transition. So I was describing sort of a European role, but even in the CCS role, what all of the majors are doing are pursuing these kinds of projects around the globe, and saying, yes, if hydrogen can be a great energy carrier, then we can tack perhaps CCS onto a lot of the work we do in the African continent. So they can still do oil and gas development, but if we tack CCS on top of that, if we produce hydrogen from the natural gas that's produced with carbon capture and storage, then we can deliver on our part, and we are big, capital-rich, technically sophisticated players. We should be the ones that deliver on our part of the energy transition in that way. There's a lot of controversy around that, right? Because it fosters continued use of oil and gas. It's not unabated, right? It is addressed from a CO2 perspective, but it's still very controversial. But that's certainly how the energy companies, the oil companies, are thinking about pursuing it.
Yeah, this conversation is pretty timely. Very recently, ExxonMobil signed a $60 billion deal to acquire Pioneer Natural Resources, which is the largest oil and gas deal since Exxon acquired Mobil in 1999. And this merger, I believe, would make Exxon the largest shale gas producer in the Permian Basin, which is North America's largest source of crude oil. So, what does this deal tell us about, how ExxonMobil is viewing the future of the oil industry, and also more generally how investors are viewing the returns from investing in fossil fuels versus renewables? Because it sounds like oil is very profitable, but renewables, you hear a lot of good things about, the growth in the industry and prices coming down. So how are investors kind of balancing these different strategies?
Yeah. There's a lot in that question too. So let's see what we can do. So ExxonMobil, its capital budget, it fluctuates a little, but its capital budget is to spend something like $20 to $25 billion per year it's the capital investment portion of its budget, right? So it's all upstream development, producing oil and gas around the world. It also involves capital projects in some of their downstream businesses. I mention that in part because hopefully it puts it into context a little bit. If they're going to spend $60 billion buying a company, they had an alternative, which was to, over some time within that steady capital budget, invest comparable amounts. I mean, I know $60 billion is a big number, but over the course of a few years, you could put comparable money into organic growth. And so what oil companies are trying to do right now is to weigh how much is it worth it to quickly gain access to reserves of oil and gas versus an alternative, which is essentially to plow money on an organic basis into the reserves they have. They may not feel like they have enough reserves to carry them through a 20 or 30 year cycle. And so to buy inventory is something that they want to consider. Now, we step back and you say, okay, I think there's an answer to your question. And just like Paulina's question before it, these are the oil and gas companies that are saying, we believe that we have a 30-year business plus, right? That oil and gas will be part of our global future for a long time. It's a question of how we manage that. So we want to be responsible stewards of how we manage it. But we believe that that this is a sound business proposition for a long time. So now the question of acquiring versus doing it organically then, I mean, once you've sort of committed to the business, right, that has a lot to do with both your own perception or each company's perception of their opportunity set. It also has a lot to do with what investors are telling you they want. So the oil and gas industry is still coming off of a solid decade or more, which ended around the time of, let's say, COVID with a couple of interruptions, where there was, thanks in part to the shale revolution in the US, there was a lot of money thrown at organic growth, which never produced the returns that the industry promised. And so there were many investors that felt very disappointed in their investments in the oil and gas industry. And so the oil and gas industry saw very, very low multiples of their shares, which was a way investors, by selling the shares, by underperforming, the stocks really aren't worth a lot. And so they've embraced a philosophy where they are much more let's just describe as disciplined in terms of their capital expenditures. So the disappointment in the industry manifested in investors saying, stop, don't plow every dollar you make back into growth. And by the way, if you all do it, you'll produce too much and the price of oil will come down. Instead, ration that spending and, as investors, give us some returns, give us some dividends, give us some share buybacks, do something to actually juice the returns over the near term. There's a lot in that statement, but essentially that's the model that the oil industry is now sort of operating under. So within that context, rather than ExxonMobil say, okay, instead of spending $25 billion a year, I'm going to spend $35 billion a year for a few years and try to build the portfolio that Pioneer gave me, right, with one acquisition, much better off just buying Pioneer, not adding to the aggregate supply, if you will, but in this case, promising that they can bring certain techniques, certain processes, certain infrastructure, and certain cost of capital to a process and make it that much more profitable for investors to own. And so that's the philosophy. You mentioned returns on renewables, and by the way, you're absolutely right, for a couple of different reasons, including that you're selling into regulated markets around the world, including that there's been terrible cost inflation and operating challenges on wind. The returns have simply not been as strong as anybody would hope. We're just coming off of, I live in New York, and we're just coming off of a request on the part of two big wind developers to get some compensation for much higher costs as they're trying to build big wind farms. And the Utility Commission said, no, sorry, that's not really the way this works. And I don't know what will happen. I think they'll have to find some accommodation. But the returns on those projects are simply not what the companies hoped they would be because inflation has really become a significant issue.
So do you think that divesting from fossil fuels is a good way to reduce our dependence on them, thinking of fossil fuels, pressure oil companies to change their behavior? Or do you think that there are more effective ways to influence them, such as engaging with them or using shareholder activism? We can think of BlackRock, we can think of mutual funds, ETFs, and maybe you can walk us through that a bit.
Sure. I guess the short answer is I do. I mean, I think that it is a part of a larger process of the world saying that we need to work much more aggressively to lower our consumption of fossil fuels. You know, if you go through a sort of a hierarchy, then doing it at a legal level in saying, okay, we're going to mandate this, that such by a certain date, this kind of emitting asset needs to be retired. So let's just think of a coal-fired power plant or something. Countries basically saying, we are committing that by a certain date, we are simply going to wind those down. By virtue of doing that, you then say, well, okay, and then what, right? How are we going to replace that? Okay, so then you have policies around supporting the replacement of that electric power with clean energy. So regulatory, legal, that's, sort of the clearest way. And frankly, that's what a lot of companies would like. I mean, it's one thing to say they like for no change because it's profitable, but legal direction and clarity, companies can work with that. You say you give me 20 years, and there might be lobbying around it, but at the end of the day, it's 20 years. Okay, then they work to shift their business to accommodate for that. Fine. If you talk to economists in general, that's a difficult proposition in some ways, just to start regulating, okay, by this date, it's done. And so that's when the conversation around carbon taxes comes in, which is to say, nope, we don't really know what this looks like. We don't really know what the best way to decarbonize is. But if we set a robust price of carbon, right, for that externality, then the marketplace will figure it out. And there's something that's very attractive, right? Because it allows for a lot of flexibility, and very clever people can work on technologies, and they can say, okay, that carbon is $70 a ton or whatever the number is. We'll figure out ways to make that work. That's also very difficult because these things don't take very long for the costs and the risks, not just to the companies, but to the consumers, to become apparent. So you're seeing pushback in Europe for to replace their boilers with heat pumps, right? Say in Germany. There's a realization that, oh wait, this is going to cost a lot of money, and maybe the government's helping, but maybe they're not fully helping, or maybe they can only afford to do so much. And next thing you know, consumers are bothered by that, right? For natural reasons. So these things hit walls. And so instead of simple, if that's simple, right? But instead of sort of simple legal answers or carbon taxes, we sort of we're doing what we're doing, which is creating sort of tax incentives and trying to throw money in the direction of spurring activity the way the Inflation Reduction Act does in the United States, where we're giving it's hundreds of billions of dollars essentially in tax incentives in one way or another towards clean energy adoption. Part of the process is through this investor action and shareholder action. And it gets into this whole issue of whether that's what investors should be doing, and we can talk about that a little bit as well. But the collective understanding or the collective pressure that we need to be moving towards this, even though we don't exactly know what the path is, but we need to be moving towards this, is very powerful. There are two ways of approaching it, right? Someone can simply sell fossil fuel company as stock. If you create enough selling pressure, then the companies say, oh gosh, not enough people want to own our shares. We have to do something different. We have to change. That's a very long and difficult process. I mean, I'm not really in favor of divestment as a strategy. I think it just pushes the responsibility off on someone else. Instead, there is engagement, there are engagement opportunities. And that's what a number of the largest institutions are basically saying. Look, we're not going to get out of, either because they can't in terms of the mandate of how they have to invest, or because they see the shortcomings in that strategy. But we're not simply going to get out of these companies, but rather we're going to try to engage with managements. We're going to try to push them to have realistic transition plans so that it becomes that much more intrinsic to these companies for how they are going to work towards something, their own version of net zero. So.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. And it's definitely a tricky situation. I know a lot of colleges, universities have also felt pressure, to divest from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not you can't do it the next year. They have a lot of, investment plans for the next decade. It takes a lot of planning. So do you think Wall Street is doing enough and putting enough pressure on the fossil fuel industry to decarbonize, whether through divestment or shareholder activism engagement? What role does Wall Street, or should Wall Street, play in the energy transition?
Yeah, it really is. I find it a really hard question. I really do, because the classic Wall Street answer, which, by the way, a number of now state governments have decided that that's what they think, it should be too, is to make their fiduciary responsibility, right, is to make their clients money, and not to engage in what might be described as sort of social, I'll say tinkering. That doesn't give it enough weight, but to engage in sort of a social agenda. life is much simpler for Wall Street if that's the case. Everyone sort of understands the rules. And what Wall Street in that scenario is saying is change the law. Congress, change the laws, and then the companies will respond, and we will respond, and all of that. Again, give us the roadmap for the rules, and then we will follow them. And there's a lot of support for that way of thinking. Unfortunately, I think it misses a couple of things. First, it misses the fact that to some degree, we all as citizens need to act and we can't rely on governments, especially the nature of our government, but many governments, we can't necessarily rely on them to do what's necessary fast enough. And so there's an element of, we all kind of need to push here because realistically the planet's warming too quickly. We have responsibilities as individuals that we need to act on. I think maybe that's still a tough answer for Wall Street to really accept as a business model, frankly. I think maybe another way to look at it is, and this is the way a lot of the collective agencies that are pushing financial institutions toward net zero are looking at it, is saying, yes, but we think you need to look at risk differently than you have historically looked at it, Wall Street companies collectively. There's a lot of basic financial theory around the idea of the time value of money. In the time value of money, a dollar that you have in hand today is worth more than it would be in a year from now. And you can come at that in a couple of different ways, but if you have a dollar, you can invest it. And in a very riskless way, I can get 5%. So in a year, I'd have $1.05, right? So yes, my dollar today is worth more than if I had a dollar tomorrow because there was an opportunity cost that I didn't take advantage of. Another way of thinking of it is even though it's all winds up being the same, but there's risk. You don't know if you're going to get that dollar in a year. If you have it now, you have it. Right? A whole sort of set of modeling gets built around that in terms of returns. And we talked about risk and reward before. So if someone thinking about an investment somewhere and they're trying to assess risk, what has been left out of the equation is the risk related to climate change. And it's often framed as a risk that is 30 years away for whatever business, right? Stranded assets, if you're thinking about fossil business or whatever, it's far off. Yes, we are seeing very intimately now that the insurance companies are paying more out than they ever have because the disasters get bigger and bigger. And so that industry has challenges, but that doesn't necessarily affect all the other businesses that have insurance policies. I mean, yes, they have to pay more for those insurance policies, but it's not enough of really flowing through the climate risk. But part of that mindset is built around, well, whatever happens 30 years from now, I'd be discounting that by whatever percent every year. So again, I know this isn't really a financial theory conversation, but whatever happens 30 years from now is worth a lot less to me than the same dollar today. And so it has a way of making decision-making naturally nearer term. It just does. And that's the kind of thing that I lived with as an analyst every day, and any kind of investor does. But if we could think about those risk profiles, and whether it's a question of how big the numbers are or just the time frames and thinking about the risk associated with it, and you stop discounting it or stop discounting it so much, then the numbers get a lot bigger. And the reason I'm trying to walk through all of this, and I know it's not that simple, but if Wall Street's going to really act differently and start to pressure companies to change their business models and decarbonize a lot more quickly, then some of the numbers of the potential costs of inaction, however you frame them, need to look a lot bigger. And so you need to start having real investment analysis that incorporates the externalities that are pretty hard to get your arms around, but that's essentially what the push has to be. And so Wall Street in that way needs to act in a way that Wall Street naturally acts, which is to evaluate risk. That's what Wall Street does. And we need to have them get the tools and be tooled to think along those lines to do that.
That is a very interesting approach, and it makes us think about looking at risk differently, especially as it comes to climate change, as you were mentioning. And something that we've been also thinking about is Exxon Mobil's announcement to be net zero by 2050. So what this means to the plans that they have to balance greenhouse gas emissions within the actions that remove and offset them, such as carbon capture storage, hydrogen, biofuel, nature-based solutions that we've also talked about a bit. And we can know that some people can be skeptical about this announcement because their core business is still based on oil and gas. So what are your thoughts about this this announcement? Is it realistic? Is it credible? Or maybe even so, how can oil companies be part of the solution and still contribute to the energy transition aside from the ways that we've already talked about?
So there's a little bit of a risk, maybe more than a little bit of a risk, that I'm going to get this wrong. But when Exxon talks about being net zero, what it's focusing on are its scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So maybe a little bit of definition. I mentioned that briefly before, but maybe a little bit of definition, right? So scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are associated with the product you make, but directly, right? So in this case, it's what emissions are associated with producing oil and gas. Scope 2 emissions are what power did it take to produce your product, which for an ExxonMobil, just to keep on the upstream side of things, is, you hired a contractor, there is some electricity or there's some diesel that is used in that process of drilling for that well, running the compressor to something to pump it up. So you've got some emissions associated with that. And what ExxonMobil is saying is, we are going to have that as our business, and we will abate through CCS as well as other activities, we will abate the emissions associated with that. But of course, the product gets burned and emits carbon dioxide when it gets burned, right? It gets burned when it's put in your tank and you drive your car. It gets burned in every other use of oil. That's not what they're saying they are going to abate. I think it's very plausible that they will achieve their scope 1 and scope 2. And I'm not trying to take away from how much effort that takes and that they are putting into it. That's not really what I want to do. I mean, we can talk about, are they spending enough? And there's an argument that they could spend more and all that. But I believe that they are focused on achieving that target, and they think that's a responsible part of being on this planet, right? As a company, that's what they're trying to do. The argument would be, maybe should be, that that's not enough, but they rather need to address this scope 3. But the response really is, yeah, but that's, again, it's legal to make a product that gets burned. So it kind of gets back to your question of, well, how do you really drive the demand to zero? And what does it take to do that? Now, that's not to say that there aren't some things that companies can do. There's cooperative elements you can make with auto manufacturers so that your emissions are that much lower if you're still burning fossil fuels, for example. There are things that the oil companies can do and are doing to try to lessen the emittive nature and the scope 3 through technology development work. And I do think that that's certainly part of what their commitment should be and has to be. But it does involve engaging, yes, making scope 3 commitments per se. So
yeah, it's complicated, and it kind of all goes back to our question of how can we use financing and investments, to transition away from fossil fuels. So as we conclude here, I'd love to hear about what inspires or motivates you about the future of the energy transition and how we can take action to invest in a more decarbonized world, because it sounds like, where we put our money really matters.
Yeah, I guess there's a few things which seem encouraging, right? It's so easy to be down about how quickly the planet's warming and the stickiness of rich governments funding developing countries and not providing the funds. But there is a lot of things, and maybe some of them are little things, but there's a number of things which feel like they're powerful. The first is that the technology itself. I mean, I think you alluded to this, Justine, in your comments. I'm pretty sure it was you. But the cost of providing clean energy has fallen so dramatically over the last decade. It's really stunning. it has far exceeded what many had hoped in terms of learning curve development. And so you say, well, okay, it's harder now than it was 2 years ago because interest rates are higher and these are very capital intensive projects. So it's a little harder, but the incentive is there because lower cost power it can be available. There's also a better understanding, even then a couple of years ago, I think, in terms of how to manage grids to incorporate the fact that these are variable sources of energy, like the sun has to be shining kind of comment, versus 24/7 availability coming from fossil fuels. I mean, that's not a trivial issue, but there seems to be a better understanding. I've also alluded to a couple of things, but to come back to them, there is, I think, an honest push at a place like the World Bank and other multilateral institutions to try to shift that focus to spur more money. There are mechanisms which can be pointed to, which have had success in terms of catalyzing. That $1 of public spend brings $10 of private. It has to probably bring 100, but at least you're starting to sort of walk in that direction. You are seeing significant amounts of money put towards announcements by governments around the world towards trying to progress this. So Chile is a notable example where they've started a process of closing off their fossil fuel, their coal plants. There's even monies being dedicated out of petrostates. The United Arab Emirates, for example, is putting significant amounts of money into carbon sequestration, into new technologies, into carbon markets to try to preserve forests, which have their own rules in carbon sinks. So these are all parts of decarbonization efforts. And so you do see kind of a galvanizing, even if it's not nearly at the pace you need to, but hopefully that builds its own momentum and you have people answering the call and following suit and seeing that it can be done and that it can be made sense. So you do also have, I guess it's almost becoming a laundry list, I guess, right? We can sort of evaluate different how important it is, but you do, if I harped on the rich governments thing and they're not fulfilling their $100 billion commitments, but they are indeed actively engaging with other communities in the developing world to try to decarbonize. So there are programs called Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which have been signed with South Africa, with Indonesia, with Vietnam. I think I'm leaving someone out, but there are potentially more, which bring a holistic countrywide scope to, okay, you say you're willing to go with this commitment to decarbonize, to transition to net zero. That's a massive undertaking that's going to cost each country hundreds of billions of dollars along the way. How can the US and European nations and other developed economies kind of contribute to starting that process? That's what the JET-P process essentially is. So it's taking coal-dependent power countries and saying, okay, we understand how challenging it is. Where can we pinch hit? Where can we give you a little bit of that catalytic funds so that we start to lay the groundwork for you to attract a whole lot more private money? So between that and ongoing improvements in technology, right, we're on the cusp perhaps of developing green hydrogen and bringing those costs down, and all of, it's a lot of things which you can point to say, yep, okay, we actually can do this, right? And we have a lot of collective interest, visible collective interest in trying to make this work.
Absolutely. And maybe in closing, is there anything that you would like our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Well, if your listeners are trying to figure out how to invest in opportunities or something like that, there certainly are, we're talking about trying to shift trillions of dollars from one part of the world to another part of the world, and from some comfortable investment industries into less comfortable investment industries. But there are all kinds of ways where that can be done, and that can be done at a private or certainly institutional investor level, whether it's VC capital, because you're still developing a lot of different technologies, so you're changing risk profiles in that way, or even in looking at impact funds, there are billions being raised. So to the extent that your listeners are a little bit more sort of on the individual side, trying to make an action with their dollars, there are definitely ways that they can invest, because there's literally, tens of billions of dollars have been raised this year, and are in a position where they can solicit additional funds to try to put towards both new and established clean technologies. So that's certainly available to them.
Absolutely, because one of our mottos here is thinking about the energy transition and how it's not only collective, but it's also based on our individual choices. So thinking that it's also up to us. So I think that this is a great way to inform our audience.
Terrific. Yes, there's a lot of behavioral change that can happen, but good. I'm glad you think so.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Brad, for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
We covered a lot of ground today exploring the costs and financing challenges of the energy transition.
To me, what was interesting was the price tag that is huge for transitioning our systems to clean energy. We're talking maybe about 9 trillion per year through 2050. And to me, that's a staggering amount. Like, even though there is some shifting in existing investments, it's still important for us to think about mobilizing that capital, and that scale won't be easy.
My greatest takeaway is that there's the gap between the rich and the poor nations in financing the transition. So much of money flows into developed countries because the risks are lower. There's a strong rule of law, there's stable currencies, there are liquid markets. Developing nations need a ton of help to attract private capital and to reduce those investment risks.
And even despite growing climate pressures, big oil is still very profitable with high oil prices. And companies are divided through on managing gradual decline while keeping shareholders happy. So their role in the transition is still very controversial.
Yeah, so these are some key tensions and takeaways around the dollars and cents of going green. There are definitely huge challenges that we still face on cost and financing, but also opportunities to think creatively and spur new solutions.
What did you find most interesting about today's show? We'd love to hear and keep chatting about the implications of the cost of going green. If you're interested in this topic, stay tuned for Part B, where we look at these implications from the perspective of the Global South with a student panel of 4 mineral economics students from Ghana who are studying at the Colorado School of Mines, Eben, John, Ruben, and Felix, who help us better understand the perspectives from sub-Saharan Africa, where sustainable development must go hand in hand with decarbonization goals.
We would like to thank the USC Oshagi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a low-carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Special thanks also to our guests for today, and Avi, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to Energy Transition Talk. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we would appreciate it so much if you could leave a rating and review and subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina, signing off from Energy Transition Talk. Stay tuned for Part B of our episode next week.